Project Management for Healthcare Managers, Week 5, Project Planning, Risk Management, HCML 375. Project risk is about dealing with uncertainty and being able to manage that uncertainty by being proactive and being able to get ahead of issues before they get out of hand. Project risk is that uncertain event that occurs that has a positive or negative effect on one or more of the project objectives, such as scope, schedule, cost, and quality. Managing risk is done by prescriptive format to be able to determine what to be looking at and how to deal with uncertainty if it does come up. The steps to managing risk are that we need to determine the overall risk tolerance for the company and the organization. Then to be able to collect the risks and identify the risk weight and calculate on a scale, and evaluate the priority and then use the high risks, the ones with the highest weight. Then we come up with a way to detect them and look at the triggers, and then come up with some sort of mitigation or contingency planning to take care of those issues when they arise. The first step to be able to do risk management is to be able to determine risk tolerance or the risk avoidance of the specific company or organization. This will usually be seen in a strategy on how aggressive the strategy is to the results and how much they follow through, how much they adhere to their rules and standard processes. Another consideration in risk tolerance is if there's any sort of reinforcement or negative consequences that are used. Are there audits taking place? And is there a process to bring things back into control? This is where companies will pay to avoid risk, and the more you can be prescriptive about risk, the more companies will take into account and be supportive of the risk management program. Risk tolerance isn't necessarily taking on more risk and being foolhardy. Which commonly happens in companies is that risk tolerant is usually they're unaware of how much money risk will take, or how much the issues and defects will cost if that risk becomes an issue and needs to be worked. So risk avoidance is seen in those companies that are diligent in keeping on track, and risk tolerant companies are the ones that fail to pay attention. The next thing we need to do is identify a risk list from the sources of risk. We need to be able to identify different sources of risk and develop a list of risks that we can do, and we can do that a couple of ways. One of the ways is to develop a risk list through expert judgment, the people who are on hand, and the subject matter experts. Using interviewing and brainstorming methods, we'll ask them to compile a list of what risks may happen. Another way to do this is to go through your organizational process assets, or documents that were created from the last project, to see what risks they had to deal with. What did they brainstorm together, and what did they actually encounter? The sources of risk to analyze are what are the risks are internal to the project, are the things having to do with specific budget or scope of the project. External factors need to be considered, such as weather or time of year. There can be a technical type of risks that are inherent in an IT project, and an operational risk that may have to do with the business function. And economics would be financial impacts that could occur on the project. There are ways to identify sources of risk. There's a diagramming method where risk is identified through a work breakdown structure. Through the diagram of the work breakdown structure, different risks can be identified and brought up that way. Another way to identify risk is through cause and effect. There are Ishikawa or fishbone diagrams that can be used to support cause and effect, and this would be another way to identify sources of risk. A process flow that looks very similar to work breakdown structure. It identifies the process steps that occur at a very high level and gives visual pictures of what the bottlenecks can occur between each process step. An influence diagram is like a current reality tree diagram where the risks are identified and the basis of their influence. Another way of doing a risk analysis is through a SWOT analysis. You bring the team together and identify the strengths. From the strengths you might find some positive risks. And then from the weaknesses you might get some negative risks. From the opportunities you might get some positive risks, and when you identify the threats, this would be the source of negative risks. During this presentation, we've been talking about negative and positive, or good risk and bad risk. PMI doesn't differentiate risk. Anytime a project doesn't occur on time or on budget, that variation is caused by issues and risks. PMI classifies good or positive risk that when it occurs, you are spending less money or the project is getting done earlier than expected. And a negative risk is when it occurs when you have to spend more money or the project takes too long. Changes in scope may also be considered good and bad in risk management. Bad risk is something to avoid, and good risks are to use and exploit. Once the risks have been identified, there is a qualitative analysis to determine the risk weight. There isn't a single good risk weight measurement system. You can't put risk on a scale and give the relative amount of metric behind it. There are some different tools you can use to get risk weight. These tools may be a simple matrix or more complex like an FMEA, where we could visualize it on a grid. For a simple matrix, we take two aspects and we identify those aspects, and we give value to those aspects and come up with a risk weight value. The two factors we look at on a simple matrix are the probability of occurrence and the magnitude of impact. The probability of occurrence is how likely is this going to happen. If it's pretty likely, then the possibility of occurrence would be pretty high. But if it's unlikely to happen, if it's rare and occurring, then the probability of occurrence would be low. The magnitude of impact of how severe it hits. Is it only going to affect a few people? Is the effect not going to be that much? Then that would be a low value. But if it's widespread, if it brings the whole system to a halt, that would be a big impact and it would be considered high. Once the low, medium, high of the impact and the low, medium, high of the probability are identified, that corresponding value we see in the diagram would be the risk weight. The PMBOK also has a grid, and instead of getting low, medium, high, it gives the probability in percentages. Lower percentages are located at the bottom of the scale, and higher percentages at the top. On the left side of the chart are the threats or negative types of risks, and severity is along the bottom line. So if it's low severity for a threat, it would be on the far left. As we move to the right, the severity becomes higher until you get to the mark in the middle. Where the column and the row converge is where is going to be your risk weight. On the opportunity side, it flips around, so on the left side, the most severe, and on the right side is the least severe. This will give the probability correlated to the severity when you give the risk weight. Back in the 70s, when NASA was working on the space program, it had a different way of scoring risk. Their approach was called the failure modes and effects analysis, and it used the probability of occurrence and degree of severity, and also the ability to detect was added, so that there are three factors. When you measure these three factors and assign each to a weight, you multiply them and come up with a risk priority number, or RPN. In this case, we see an FMEA sample that is listed out where the risks are listed in the first column by describing the effect or what we would see. In the third column, it gives the severity on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the most severe, 1 being the least severe. The value is entered into this column. The next column looks at the cause. What are the possible causes? And then the next column is the probability of occurrence. The more likely something is to happen, the higher the number will be. If it's likely to occur, we would give it a 10. If it's very unlikely to occur, we would give it a 1. The next column are the current controls and what's keeping it in place. The seventh column is detectability. If the event were not very detectable, you couldn't see it coming, it would be given a high number. If the event is predicted and you can see it coming from a long way, you would get a low number. An example of this is the difference between an earthquake and a hurricane. With a hurricane, there are global satellites and weather tracking, and you can see the hurricane for some time, and you have the ability to prepare. With an earthquake, there is no visualization you can do. You can't see it coming, so you can't take steps to prepare. The detectability for an earthquake would be a 10, and the detectability for a hurricane would be low, down near 3 or 4. When you multiply the three values together, multiply the severity times the occurrence times the detectability, you come up with your RPN. The rest is to manage the risk going forward. What is the response? Who is responsible? And what are the actions taken? Another way of visualizing risk is on a grid. We don't give it a numeric value, we give it a color value to it. We have a high likelihood of occurrence and a high severity of impact. That would be the red. If there's a low likelihood of occurrence and low severity, it would be in the green area, and it would be less of a risk. Once we've identified the risk, we create a response to what we're going to do. At a high level, the responses with the negative risks are to avoid the risk and keep it from happening in the first place. Transferring is where you transfer the responsibility or effect to something else. Sometimes this is done by purchasing insurance, because when you use insurance, you transfer the effect onto a different account. Mitigating this takes steps to make it less, and accepting is to do nothing. Accepting is taking on the risk as it is, allowing the event to happen without intervention. For positive risks, such as getting done early, you exploit and can take the benefits of the risk and encourage it to happen. You can enhance it by making it even more valuable than it currently is. And you can share the risk between other projects, or you can accept it for what it is. Once you've identified the response, what are the early warnings for the risk? What are the triggers to pay attention to, and how do we budget to mitigate the potential risk during the budgeting phase? You may want to add contingency or reserve to allow extra to be able to pay for the effects of risk. When we go through the risk evaluation and determine the probability and severity of occurrence before we can ask for that contingency and a reserve to be set aside. To review the steps, the first thing to do is to determine the overall risk tolerance and create a list from the sources of risk. Once we create the list, we can do a qualitative analysis and prioritize our list of risks, and then create the risk responses and look for what kind of triggers are available to tell us when the risk is coming, and to build a contingency to be able to pay for it if that risk does occur.